Hey, David Brewster here with another episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Triumph. And I've actually had a lot of requests for Rik Emmett and the music of Triumph. That was kind of a shock. And, Triumph's been around since 1975, and most people out there think of them as an 80s band. But, that Canadian trio has been around since the 70s, and they definitely have a lot of hits that you hear on classic rock radio. But a lot of players don't really realize how important and how talented Rik Emmett is. He's a great guitarist, and you can definitely hear, traces of rock and blues and jazz and classical. I've heard him play dobro and 12-string and acoustic and electric, guitar, and he's a great player. Just shared that image there, but Rik Emmett is a world-class, musician. He wrote for Guitar Player magazine for years, and I know when I was younger, I'd get Guitar Player and I would read the interviews and the articles, but I would always spend time with the lessons, and I would always kind of flip to Rik's lesson, and see what he was, breaking down. And his series was called Back to Basics, so it was usually, fundamentals, chords and mastering the fretboard and scales and modes and stuff like that. And, one foot would be in music theory and the other foot would be in the real world, realistic, guitar, situations. And it was really interesting to read, his lessons. And then also his old Starlicks video, from the 80s. It was like 2 hours long. That's a great instructional video. I'm not sure if it actually is on YouTube. But if you haven't seen Rik's old Starlicks video, that's great. He's breaking down Triumph songs. He plays some jazz. He plays acoustic. He plays dobro. I mean, he's doing all kinds of things on there. One more story about Rik I'm going to share before we get started here. Back in the 90s, I played in a band called Dantalion, and we actually opened for Rik Emmett. And I'll never forget, I was all excited, and I thought, oh my gosh, Rik Emmett, we're opening for him. And, I remember he did the sound check, and he was just doing a solo tour. It was just him. He didn't have a band with him. And he did a sound check, and then they had like an RV that was backstage, and I remember I talked to the stage manager. I was like, can I get an autograph? Can I bug Rik? And he was like, yeah. So we knocked on the door, and Rik came out, and I was terrified. I was so nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, it's Rik Emmett, the guy from Guitar Player and Triumph and whatever. And he was so friendly, and he signed the autograph, and we talked, and I thanked him. I was like, thank you for the articles, Guitar Player. They really helped me. And I could tell he was kind of happy about that. He just kind of looked, and he shook my hand again, and he thanked me. And it was great, so what a phenomenal player and a super nice guy. With the opening, that was the song Headed for Nowhere, which is from Triumph's 1987 album Surveillance. And that's kind of a forgotten song, but I'll always remember that tune because I remember I bought the album, and I was looking through the liner notes, and I saw Steve Morse listed. And I was like, wait a minute, Steve Morse is on this album? And, I had just bought it, and I skipped right to that song. I was like, I want to hear the track with Steve Morse, and it just killed me. When I heard it, I thought, oh my gosh. So if you haven't heard, Headed for Nowhere, it's like 5 or 6 minutes long. It's rocking, and then in the middle, there's this big Guitar-mageddon, solo between Steve Morse and Rik, and it's really cool. But I really like that intro riff, and there's some interesting chord things happening, too, right after it. And it's based around arpeggios. So luckily, arpeggios and the notes of a chord played separately. So we can talk about this. Even though it is kind of a lead thing, it's based around arpeggios and chords. It moves from E minor to B minor, and then it shifts up to B minor, and then ends on F sharp minor. So you've got this little progression in the middle of that melodic phrase. Right there, that's basically E minor. And then right there, it's going to come down B minor. partial chord, you know, with those two minor shapes. And then right there it moves into B minor, and it's going to shift to F sharp minor. And then it cruises down like this fast pentatonic rhyme. And then it moves into a B power chord. And I really like this part too. It's rocking. And it almost kind of reminds me of Crushing Day, you know, from Satriani, as far as the rhythm. But then it changes, and he's doing these partial chords. So it's kind of like a partial D to partial E, partial D, and then partial B to partial A. So it's a busy little pattern, but you've got this. Big D to a big A, but that little B movement there, I like that. You know, it's simple, and there's a ton of great, you know, rock and hard rock songs that feature things like that. You know, think of Accept and groups like that, but here you can hear it in this Triumph riff. Next up we have the very famous, you know, Lay It on the Line, which is from the Just a Game album. And this is kind of flirting with an A minor 9 and then an A minor 6 add 9. And this is a very famous, you know, song and guitar part. And Rik's playing it on a 12 string, so I'm going to play it on a 6, but keep in mind he is actually playing this on a 12 string guitar. But it looks and sounds like this. So it has this really dreamy, you know, sound. And you're really hearing, you know, that transition, you know, between those two chords, the A minor 9 and A minor 6 add 9. Now on a 6-string guitar, it's kind of losing a little bit of that high, you know, kind of chirpy, you know, higher register from a 12-string. And, you know, you can kind of emulate the sound with a 6-string, but it is losing that kind of shimmery 12-string, you know, flavor. And it's mainly that C note that I'm kind of hearing, you know, that's missing. So I kind of add that in to the 13th fret. And I'm guessing, you know, when Rik played that, he probably just played those two forms. Have a 12-string guitar, you know, to try it out, but I'm guessing that's probably what you're hearing, because you keep hearing this high C note in there. You know, really interesting. The next example comes from the song Magic Power, and this is another famous, you know, Triumph song, and this is the interlude, so it's kind of functioning almost like a little solo. And Rik's outlining this chord progression, you know, using a D arpeggio form, you know, this kind of very common, you know, D major fingering there for a D major chord or arpeggio. And you can catch, you know, David Gilmour, Eddie Van Halen, Slash. There's a whole bunch of guitarists, you know, that have used that fingering as kind of a guide or a roadmap, you know, when they're playing a solo. And here you can see Rik's doing this glorified version, something like this. And there you can see he basically started on D. And there he kind of played with like the sus2 and the sus4, you know, adding the G and also that open high E string. Then he moves up to an F. An F over D, technically. And there you can see it's kind of a stretch for the pinky, but he's grabbing, you know, he's grabbing that B flat and going back to the A. And there you can see he's grabbing that G and then going back to that F note right there. So there's a little melodic phrase happening, you know, in the middle of that chord. And go up a whole step and do the exact same thing. After that, he moves up to this B flat. It's like a B flat over D. And then a C over D. And then he ends with this really high D way up here. So it's interesting to see a whole, you know, interlude or solo kind of, you know, worked out using these little D forms or arpeggio shapes. Something like this. I really like that. The next example actually came from his instructional video, his old Starlicks video, you know, from the 80s. And in that video, he breaks down a whole bunch of stuff, you know, but there's a kind of a jazzy fingerstyle piece called Glad Hands that he put on there. And I'm just going to show the opening, like the beginning. And he admitted on the video that it was kind of a chord workout or a fingering, you know, fret hand workout, because the chords, you know, every chord changes, you know, the fingering and the way you're playing. So it's a busy, you know, challenge for your fret hand. And it has this real loungy kind of jazz feel to it, something like this. Really interesting. So it starts with E, and then this is going to be a G sharp minor 7 flat 5, and then a C sharp 7 to G7. So right there, right off the bat, there's a tricky, you know, sequence of chords right there. And then you're going to slide an F minor 7 to F sharp minor 7, and then A minor 7 to B7 to F7. So it's weird. And then the last time, right there, he slides that F to F sharp minor 7, and then an A minor 7, grabs a single B, and then he starts doing this, you know, B to C trill on the G string. So there's a little bit of finger independence, you know, happening there, because you definitely need a strong pinky finger to hold this note while you're also doing that little trill on the G string. You know, I love stuff like that. It's challenging, but it's really interesting and good to work on. The last example here comes from the song Never Surrender, which is from the album Never Surrender. I think that was, what, 1982 or something like that? But anyway, this is a really interesting guitar part, and there's some, you know, really cool chord moves happening. And you really have to pay attention to Rik when he's playing, because he throws out all these really cool chords and inversions and kind of mutations of chords. And it starts off and it's just hitting, you know, like an A minor 7 to a B minor 7, and then an E minor 7. So there's this 3-chord, you know, hit. And they're all minor 7th chords, but the A minor 7 he's playing like this, B minor 7, and then E minor 7, which is like this. So you can kind of think of that like the Hendrix chord, but your index finger is back to G. So it's not a, you know, an E7 sharp 9, it's just an E minor 7. So he's doing this. Begins. Guitar part. There's a lot going on right there. So you've got the minor 7 tags there in the beginning, or, you know, tags or strums, whatever. And then it goes goes to an E minor 7 like this. And then you're going to play a D major, but you're playing it this way. And then A minor. And then it's C major to D major, like little triad arpeggios. And then you do it again. E minor 7, D, A minor, C, D. Guitar part, and it's not typical hearing things like that in rock. That's kind of reminded me more of like R&B and like soul, or almost like a reggae kind of thing. And the groove is interesting too. It definitely has this kind of syncopated kind of groove, so it's not a straight 4 on the floor rock and roll song. It's got something else happening in there. That's going to wrap this look at the Chords of Triumph and of course Rik Emmett. And I tried to include a variety of different things. There's kind of a jazzy idea, some rock ideas, some of the clean kind of 12-string stuff. And somebody like Rik Emmett, it's hard to capture everything that's unique or special about his music. In a lesson like this, I would have to extend this like to an hour or two just to really break down all the things that he's very skilled at and very known for doing in music. And very interesting guitarist, and so commonly overlooked. A lot of people kind of forget about him, and it's like, oh yeah, the guy from Triumph, he's a monster, and he really is. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more lessons and material. Thank you.